Kenya lies on the east coast of Africa, bordered on one side by the Indian Ocean. It's surrounded by the countries of Tanzania, Uganda, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Somalia. It's still mostly a wild land. From the summit of Mt.Kenya down to the plains of Kenya, the animals of Africa run wild and free. We're all very familiar with many of the animals of Africa, from hyena cubs to elephants. But it's generally the larger animals of Africa that attract our interests, such as a hippopotamus, while some of the other less familiar are just as interesting. How about a millipede? Or another little fellow that's called a dung beetle. The dung beetle spends its entire life precariously rolling a ball of dung across the plains of Africa, searching for a place to hide it so it can raise its young. The Great Rift Valley is one of the largest geological features of Africa. It begins up near the Red Sea and runs deep into the heart of Africa. It's two halves of Africa that are slowly splitting apart, and scientists say someday the waters of the Indian Ocean will fill the void. But today, when you stand on the escarpment and look down some 2,000 to 3,000 feet into the base of the rift, you see not the waters of the Indian Ocean, but a string of lakes, pearls in the African countryside, and one of the best bird viewing areas in the world. Birds such as the yellow-necked spurfowl, and the battler's eagle, which spreads its wings in the early morning to capture the first rays of the sun. 1 out of 20 species of birds in the world can be found in Kenya's Rift Valley. Lake Nakuru has been set aside as a national park to preserve the waterfowl of the region. Species such as the yellow-billed stork stalking the muddy flats for a meal, while on rocks at the water's edge, cormorants preen themselves before diving. And in the shallows, paddlebills probe through the mud like hungry teenagers. In the thorn trees along the lake's edges, weaver birds construct their intricate nests. The males do all the work. They then flutter there, attempting to attract a female. The volcanic forces that shape much of the Rift Valley are still evident in geysers and hot springs, such as those found along the shores of Lake Hannington. These geysers and hot springs feed the alkaline waters of the lake where the greater and lesser flamingo live. They feed on the blue-green algae that flourishes in the lake. Scientists say there are several million flamingos to be found in Kenya's Rift Valley, and sometimes the majority of them will congregate at one lake, a vast ribbon of pink in the African countryside. Visitors to Africa are usually not surprised to find large numbers of birds when they arrive in Kenya, nor are they usually surprised to find large numbers of wild animals, such as a zebra. But most visitors are astounded to see a skyline that looks totally out of place in the African countryside. Nairobi, Kenya's largest city, its capital, a bustling metropolitan area of almost 1 million people strong. Your greatest danger in traveling to Africa is not being eaten by a lion. It's being run over in the traffic of Nairobi. Kenya has one of the most dominant skylines of any black African nation, largely because of the stability of the country and the economic progress that it's enjoyed since independence. From the British, they inherited a parliamentary system of government, but it was really their first president, Jomo Kenyatta, that set a standard of leadership, one of moderation, alignment with the Western world, and capitalism coupled with African socialism. After his death, Daniel Arap Moi took over in a peaceful transition of power, continuing in his policies. Because of the stability of Kenya, each year from all over the world, hundreds of thousands of visitors come to stay in Kenya's fine lodges and hotels that are as comfortable as any in the United States or Europe. Surrounding many of these great lodges are wonderful gardens. For Kenya's highland region enjoys one of the most equitable climates in the world. There's no true winter as we know it. Both temperate and tropical flowers flourish the year round. Visitors find life in these gardens intriguing. Familiar creatures such as bees and butterflies, along with more exotic ones such as the horned chameleon, with turret-like eyes that work independently of each other and a skin that changes color rapidly to match the background. But as intriguing as life in the gardens is for the visitor, what they've really come to Africa to see are the parks. And located in the central part of Kenya is Mt.Kenya National Park. There is no true jungle in Kenya, but surrounding the base of Mount Kenya is a very densely forested region with its unusual equatorial wildlife and vegetation. It attracts visitors who can take a dirt road to about 10,000 feet on the mountain. If they wish to go any higher than that, they're going to have to walk. And each year, several thousand people walk up Mount Kenya. Only a handful of them will make it to the summit of Mount Kenya at 17,058 feet, for there are many obstacles on the way. And one of the first obstacles that a hiker encounters is a very steep section of trail that's appropriately called the vertical bog, for this part of the trail is covered with anywhere from 3 to 12 inches of very wet, sticky, gooey mud. Some people never learn the secret, which is simply to jump from tussock of grass to tussock of grass, thus evading the mud. You could say they spend their entire time getting bogged down. Every time you fall down, you can see Mount Kenya glimmering on the horizon. If you're still hiking at noon, you'll probably be caught in a rainstorm, for it rains almost every day on the mountain. It was in such a rainstorm that I met this apparition. I wasn't sure if I should help or run. And do you know, she wasn't looking for a contact. If you survive the vertical bog, at about 13,000 feet, you come into a much drier region where the giant groundsels grow, right underneath the glaciers of Mount Kenya. Mount Kenya is one of the most difficult mountains in the world to climb, for there's no easy way up it. The easiest way requires high technical rock climbing skills. The mountain once soared some 23,000 feet above the African plains. Glacial action and weathering has eroded it until all that remains is the plug of the volcano and some excellent high altitude rock climbing. There's a wonderful sense of freedom that comes on being on a great mountain. You can feel the pulse of the earth in your hands. You can reach up and touch the clouds in the sky with your fingertips. Many people believe that the ropes are used for climbing on. They're actually for protection. As you proceed up the climbing route, you place chalk stones or pitons in cracks in the rocks. These are attached to the climbing rope through slings and carabiners. In this way, if you fall, you don't fall all the way down the mountain, only the length of the rope. There are other hazards besides falling when climbing Mount Kenya, for the monsoon winds that blow across the Indian Ocean pick up a tremendous amount of moisture. When they come up against the mountain creates its own weather. Sudden storms can spring up very quickly, obscuring the faces with rain, sleet, and snow. On the day we picked to climb Mount Kenya, such a storm came up, forcing us to retreat. A retreat off a great mountain is sometimes more difficult than actually climbing it. For the rocks are icy, the hands are cold, and the ropes are slippery and wet. Fortunately, we were being led by one of the best mountaineers of Africa, Phil Snyder, a young American who came to Kenya 10 years ago to climb the major mountain peaks of Africa. He was hired by the Kenya National Park Service to teach mountain rescue techniques to the rangers on Mount Kenya. And each year, he and his rangers pluck people off of the sheer vertical faces of Mount Kenya and lower them to safety. Because of the isolated position of the mountain and the need for medical attention, one of the most important elements in any rescue operation is speed. Phil and the rangers are constantly practicing their skills so they can get an injured person to a hospital as quickly as possible. You've all no doubt heard about the Lone Ranger to the rescue. Well, how about a whole bunch of mountain rangers to the rescue? Keep your eye on the guy with the brown hat. He's Mr. Enthusiasm. Here he goes again, and this time it's going to be head first. Let's not forget our friend with the brown hat. In all seriousness, each year these rangers risk their own lives to save people on the mountains. Phil has other responsibilities. He's frequently flying his small Super Cub across the forests of Mount Kenya, searching for poachers. Poaching is big business in Africa. Phil and his rangers are committed to stopping this poaching. He flies quite low, sometimes below tree level, In an effort to surprise the poachers, he can land his plane on almost any of the clearings dotted throughout the forest region, provided he can chase the animals away first. If there's any problems, the rangers will contact him. The main targets of poachers are elephants and rhinoceros, but other animals are hurt as well in the pursuit of profit from wildlife. The Kenya government is making a determined effort to halt the poaching, largely because of revenues that come from tourists who stay in lodges such as the Ark in the middle of the Aberdares. From extremely comfortable surroundings, from the dining room, their bedroom, or the balcony, the visitor can observe the animals of Africa in their native environment. And one of the features that I enjoy the most about these lodges is that you can learn a little bit about the behavior of the animals. For instance, the elephant commonly eats soil in certain areas. In this way, it adds salts and minerals to its diet. Knowing this, many of the lodges put out salt to attract the animals. Elephants are very sociable animals, and they make a wide variety of sounds, from rumblings of the stomach to trumpeting. Over the years, Phil Snyder's learned to imitate many of the sounds that an elephant makes. And using these imitated elephant sounds, he'll call the elephants out of the bush, hold conversations with them. Usually they're very short conversations. Since an adult male elephant can weigh anywhere from 3 to 4 tons, it was always my hope Phil wouldn't say anything wrong to one of these elephants. Usually, once the elephant has satisfied his curiosity that Phil isn't a danger, he'll go back to spending what he does most of his life doing, and that's eating large amounts of food. Phil's favorite animal is the rhinoceros. This prehistoric-looking creature seems totally out of place in today's landscape. It's hunted for its horn, which is not a true horn, but actually a densely matted hair and gelatin mass that protrudes from the skull of the rhino. It's worth several $1,000s in the black market. And in a country where the annual wage is around $150, that makes a tremendous temptation. Phil has one of the largest concentrations of black rhinos in the world in the mountain parks. He knows many of them by sight. Here he'd spotted a rhino that he couldn't identify, so he moved closer to get a good look at it. Something that you should only do if you're very skilled at bushcraft, as Phil is, for there are potential hazards besides the elephant rhino, such as the Cape buffalo. One of the things that Phil's learned about a rhino over the years is that a rhino can be approached very closely as long as you remain on all fours and downwind from the animal. For the rhino has very poor eyesight, must compensate with its sense of hearing and smell. The number of rhinos in Kenya has fallen from about 10,000 10 years ago to around 1,100 last year. And some people predict that unless the poaching is stopped in Africa, the rhino may eventually disappear. Now, in case any of you wish to try this on your next trip to Africa, Phil did want to demonstrate what happens if you stand up in the presence of a rhino. The response on the part of the rhino is almost instantaneous. It recognizes its true enemy and immediately sets out to shish kebab him. It took me a day to dig myself out from underneath the Land Rover, and another day to focus my eyes properly. The people of Kenya are as fascinating as any other aspect of their country. There are over 40 different tribal groups in Kenya, each tribe having its own language, clothing, food, distinct way of life. But despite this tremendous cultural diversity, in just a few years since independence, some 20 years, these people have formed a new nationality, the Kenyan people. They are people who are being profoundly influenced by Western ideas, everything from Western-style T-shirts to TV programs. Kenyans want to develop their country. They want to make it a better place for themselves and their children. They're willing to work hard for those goals. But at the same time, they also want to hold on to many of their African traditions. And one of the most important traditions in Africa is its music. Every part of Kenya has its own musical instruments, rhythms, and songs. One of the most important musical instruments in Kenya is the drum. Drums are made in a variety of ways. Generally, they're hollowed out logs that are covered with an animal skin that's heated until they achieve the correct pitch. And only then can a dance begin. Dances are much more than social activities in Kenya. They're a chance to reaffirm tribal traditions and pass them on to the next generation. Three-quarters of Kenya's people live on about 1/4 of the land, the highland region. Between 4,000 and 10,000 feet in elevation, it's covered in small farms called shambas, a few acres in size. They're passed down from father to sons, getting smaller each successive generation. Traditionally, Kenyans have been subsistence agriculturalists, growing maize, beans, cassava, millet, sorghum, bananas. But in recent years, hybrid seeds, insecticides, and fertilizers, coupled with cash crops, such as tea, coffee, and pyrethrum, have improved the standard of living in the highlands region, so that grass huts in many areas are giving way to tin-roofed huts. In most of Africa, people live in villages, but in Kenya they live on their own small farms. Within easy walking distance of most farms in Kenya is located a marketplace. And once a week they hold their market day. People come to sell excess produce and to purchase necessities from the shops, or dukas as they're called, that surround the marketplace, all of which sell essentially the same items. Kenyans are very good farmers, and they use the rich volcanic soils of the highland region to their advantage. They grow many of the crops that we're familiar with, and some that we're less familiar with. There are other sources of nutrition in Kenya besides agriculture, for Kenya has a number of large lakes, such as Lake Victoria, one of the largest freshwater lakes in the world. The Luo people that live along the shores of the lake bring in large catches of Nile perch and tilapia. These are dried in the sun and then sold throughout the central part of Africa. In contrast to much of Africa, the people that live in Kenya, particularly those that live in the highlands region, lead a relatively healthy and wealthy lifestyle. But it's still not an easy lifestyle, particularly for the woman. For a woman's life in Africa is extremely difficult. She has many duties and responsibilities, among them providing the firewood for the family, taking care of the children, and each day carrying enough water to be used by the family. This often means a walk of anywhere from 2 to 16 miles, water that's collected from communal springs, watering holes, lakes, and streams. However, scenes such as this are changing rapidly, for one of the goals of the Kenya government is to have water piped within a half-mile of each family in the highlands region. To achieve that goal, they've enlisted the help of the Kenyan people in what are called Harambee projects. Harambee is a Swahili word which means to pull together. In a Harambee project, the government, an international organization, or even the people themselves will provide the materials. But the labor is always provided by the people. In the case of the Kibachiko water scheme, over 500 miles of trench were dug by the people of the area to provide themselves with water, each family being responsible for digging a certain number of feet of trench. Harambee schemes are also used to build schools, health facilities, and churches. One of the reasons that Kenya has been very stable in comparison to many other third world countries is the government has fostered the Harambee spirit in the countryside. We tend to take water for granted. We fail to realize that in much of the world, safe, pure water is a luxury. Where it's available, it frees people to lead a healthier and wealthier lifestyle. Kenyans have been very quick to adapt to the changes. Where water is available, small-scale irrigation projects spring up so that farmers can grow their crops the year round instead of waiting for the twice-a-year rains. Western agricultural practices are common, many left over from the colonial period, others added since independence. Everything from windmills to artificial insemination of most of the dairy animals in the highland region. These are people who live in two worlds, one foot in the West and one in Africa. The majority of Kenyans in the highland region are Christians. A wedding will usually occur in a Christian church with a Christian ceremony, although it will be conducted in a tribal language. But as people of two worlds, after the Western-style ceremony, the family will return home for the African portion of the wedding. The women members of the family will dance traditional dances of welcome to the bride and the groom. The extended family plays an all-consuming role in the life of the Kenyan people. It's even more important than the tribe. In it, aunts, uncles, and cousins are just as important as brothers and sisters. It's a form of social insurance. In times of need or joy, family members assist one another, as in the case of this wedding, where every family member has given something according to their means to help the bride and groom set up their household together. Traditionally, a bride price would be exchanged. A woman was considered to be worth a certain number of cattle, sheep, and goats. But that practice is diminishing in the highlands region. At this wedding, a symbolic goat and sheep were presented to the young couple so that they could start their farm together. For the majority of Kenyans are born in the rural areas, and they have a close affinity to the land. For the young people of today, it's a far different future from that of their parents, one of great promise and also great problems. Parents will sacrifice tremendous amounts to put their children through school, for education is seen as the primary means of developing the country, both individually and nationally. To give you an example of the importance placed in education, each child in primary school is given free milk, ultra-heat-treated milk that can last for months without refrigeration. In a country of around 15.5 million people, of which 50% are under the age of 16, this is a tremendous investment of limited resources in the future. Frequently, there are not enough government schools to go around, so parents, in their zeal for education, will build their own schools, Harambe schools, physically inadequate, dirt floors, no glass in the windows, not enough books, benches, or teachers. But you won't find any discipline problems in these schools, for these students are eager to learn, and these barefooted scholars will go on to become the doctors, the lawyers, and scientists of the new Kenya. For Kenya's educational institutions include a fine university with schools of engineering, architecture, law, and computer science. Kenya is catching up with the rest of the world rapidly. It's connected by satellite space stations to the United States and Europe. They receive television live, and while I was over there, their favorite TV program was Dallas. Oil refineries and cement factories are part of today's African landscape. For international corporations have found Kenya's free enterprise system of economics a very suitable place to invest their money. Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola are battling it out for the sweet tooth of the Kenyan people. And right behind them are coming the toothpaste people. There are over 3,000 Americans living and working in Kenya. Right alongside them, a growing group of Kenyans that live lifestyles very similar to yours and mine. Kenyans that are conversant in international business practices. Kenyans that are knowledgeable about international affairs and as interested in fashion as any other people in the world. And in Nairobi, they can purchase almost all the amenities you might expect to find in an American city, most of which are produced in Kenya, everything from underarm deodorants to shoes. But there are problems associated with the rapid development of Kenya, and they're not just the problems of fitting on high-heeled shoes. For despite Kenya's remarkable economic growth, it has not kept pace with its growth of its population, for Kenya has the dubious distinction of having one of the fastest growing populations in the world. There are not only not enough jobs for the people, but there's not enough land to feed them all. The highland region is very small. It's already used intensely by small-scale farmers, and that which isn't used for small-scale agriculture is used in large tea and coffee estates. These bring in Kenya's second and third largest sources of foreign exchange. These estates are not likely to be broken up for increased food production. So what is happening to the exploding population of Kenya? Well, with very little room in the highlands region, they're leaving it. And they're moving out into the more marginal parts of the country. And as they do so, there's a growing conflict between man and animal, because the drylands and marginal areas of the country have been the traditional sanctuary of many of the animals of Africa. Some of them, such as the elephant, require large areas in which to roam and feed. When elephant populations are compressed into smaller and smaller areas, they destroy their habitat. Elephants require 300 to 400 pounds of food a day. Thorn trees with thorns that are 2 inches long and can puncture tires on vehicles do not provide adequate nutrition. Sometimes in their search for food, the animals will invade agricultural areas. And when they do so, the national parks is called in to separate man and animal. Here, Phil Snyder is planning an elephant drive with his rangers. It's a coordinated effort between rangers on foot and in vehicles while Phil supervises from the air. They've found that herding large numbers of elephants is much easier than small numbers. Less than 50 and they tend to bunch up. In this case, over 200 elephants have invaded Solio Ranch. They've broken down fences and destroyed crops. The rangers are going to drive these animals some 30 miles into a drier part of the country. This may seem like a cruel activity, but you only have to ask yourself, what would farmers in America do if there are large herds of wild animals destroying their crops? And the answer is the same in Kenya. The future of the African elephant is dim outside of the parks, but Kenya has many park areas. We're going to explore some of those park areas, and we're also going to look at some of the things that have changed in Kenya since the 20s and 30s, when Martin and Osha Johnson first traveled to Africa. They're a pair of the earliest filmmakers to work in Africa. Their photographs are an unusual and unique collection. They're used by anthropologists today to study the way of life of the Kenyan people at the time of the arrival of Europeans. Some of these people have changed very little since that time, especially those people that live in the northern part of Kenya, the nomads of this area. One of the things that's always surprised me is not that the Johnsons brought their photographs back, but that the Johnsons came back at all. Camels are known to be unruly, but this must have been one of the most difficult camels in the world. I'd like to report that camels today can be just as obnoxious. You notice the camel has no teeth on his upper jaw. Don't ever let a camel get a hold of you. He'll gum you to death. We were using camels to retrace one of the trips the Johnsons took during the 20s and 30s. We were going to walk from Lake Paradise on Mount Marsabit about 100 miles across the Chelby Desert to Lake Rudolph, also called Lake Turkana. The northern deserts of Kenya are not like the Sahara. Rather, they're a land of mud flats, short grass, thorn trees, and scrub brush, with very little rainfall. The home of many of the nomadic tribes of Kenya, the Gabra, the Rendili, Samburu, the Turkana, the Somali people who live in close harmony with the animals that they herd about this region in search of water and food. As we moved through their land, we adapted many of their practices. We began in the early morning with a simple breakfast of tea and gruel. At first light, we'd pack up our camping equipment, while Larakwa, the chief of the Rendili people and our guide through his area, was packing the camels. Using methods that are unchanged for generations, perhaps centuries, just 4 sticks lashed to the back of a camel. On it, this framework, were all of our food and supplies and water. We began walking in the early morning simply because by 1 or 2 o'clock it would be too hot to walk, 105 or more in the shade. Camels are ideal beasts of burden in the desert, not because they carry water in their humps, as some people might believe, but because of a very efficient nostril system. There's 100 times more volume in a camel nose than a human nose. It prevents any moisture from the animal's lungs reaching the atmosphere. We couldn't do that, so we walked from water hole to water hole. Without these water holes, neither man nor animal could survive well in the desert. Some of the water holes would see vast herds of goats and sheep, cattle and camels, brought by their nomadic owners. Perhaps the least influenced by Western influence of any of the tribes in Kenya. Here they continue to cling to their traditional lifestyles. In their tribe, each member of the tribe has distinct responsibilities according to their age and their sex. The young men are responsible for protecting the tribe and herding the larger animals. The children take care of the goats and the sheep. The women are responsible for providing the food and caring for the children. These people, in some respects, live very close to a Stone Age existence. But you must remember, it's only through their intelligence and their knowledge of the area that they survive in a land in which you and I would have a tremendous difficulty surviving in. Their main source of nutrition is from their herds. Animals are slaughtered for weddings, feasts, and in times of drought. But in general, they're too valuable to be eaten. Instead, they're melted. A person's wealth in the society is determined by the number of animals that he owns. Some of the tribes in the northern part of Kenya have an unusual belief, and that is that their God gave them all the cattle in the world. So if they steal from another tribe, they're only taking back what rightfully belonged to them in the first place. Traditionally, there's been a lot of cattle rustling and fighting between the different tribal groups, so that the young men between the ages of 12 and 25 were the warriors, or the Moran. They lived separately from the rest of the tribe, generally in strategic positions, areas that women could not enter. And in contrast to the rest of the tribe, they ate a great deal of meat provided by their families. Camel meat will keep about 10 days in the desert. Kenyans are extremely hospitable people, and these young men were no exception. They invited me to join them on the 7th day they were eating their camel meat. I'd like to report that nothing in the world could be tougher than 7-day-old camel meat, unless it was 10-day-old camel meat. I tried that and almost lost my nose. The Kenya government is making a determined effort to stop the fighting between the tribes, so there's much less of it today, and not too much for the young men to do, except to sit around, take care of their parents, and sing songs about themselves and the tribe. Just like teenagers anywhere in the world, how they look is important to them. They'll spend hours braiding their hair in very tight braids, then covering it with an animal fat and a red coloring called ochre. They'll also elongate their earlobes. As young men, they start by putting small pieces of wood in their earlobes. As they get older, they increase the size the wood pieces until at this age they have pieces of ivory and bone in their ears. This may look very strange to us, but you must remember that every culture in the world has its own concept of what is beautiful and what is fashionable. These young men are today growing up in a land that's dry and harsh. But it wasn't always this way, for at one time the northern deserts of Kenya were covered with tall forests, giant ferns, and bubbling brooks, especially along the shores of Lake Turkana, the 150-mile-long Jade Sea in the desert. One of the reasons that we'd walk through the desert to reach the Jade Sea was to read the unusual record that's written in the rocks along the shoreline. We found a petrified forest. Richard Leakey, current director of the National Museum of Kenya and the son of Dr. Louis Leakey, has spent the last 10 years doing research here along the shores of the lake. In addition to fossilized trees, he and his associates have discovered a unique collection of fossils, plants, animals, shells, but also bones, tools, and skulls that he believed belonged to the oldest ancestors of man. They've been dated back several million years. Whether you agree with his theories or not, one thing that we do know is that man, in contrast to the animals that have surrounded him down the millennium, has shown a tremendous ability to change. And in the northern deserts of Kenya, where water is gold, the people are continuing to change. For here there are a few rivers that flow through the desert the year round, such as the Turkwell. And on the banks of the Turkwell River, the people are cutting down the trees. These are nomads that have traded in their spears for agricultural implements. And after they clear the land, the government is coming with large earth-moving equipment to flatten and level the ground. In these irrigation projects, the people that clear the land own the land. And under the influence of water, the northern deserts of Kenya are turning green once again. For these people, it's a dream come true. No longer do they have to fear the periodic droughts that sweep across their country. The Johnsons would probably not be too surprised at these changes, for the Johnsons predicted the change would come to Africa. When they arrived in Kenya in the 20s and 30s, it was an undeveloped land. They had to build their own roads. They found great herds of animals from border to border. They documented these animals with their photography. And they predicted that within their lifetime, these animals would disappear, for they felt that the animals in development were incompatible. But they were wrong. For the Johnsons failed to anticipate the development of the parks or conservation ethic in Kenya. And today, over 6% of Kenya's land area is covered by national parks, including most of the major ecological units of the country, so that you can go to Kenya and stand in almost the same spot that the Johnsons stood and see as many animals as the Johnsons saw. And you can sit there on the African plains and listen to them. The great herds out on the plains of Africa are one of the true spectacles of the world, for nowhere else will you find such a diversity of species and such a concentration of animals. The reason for this is that each animal has its own niche in the environment. Unlike domestic animals that eat everything in sight, wild animals are very selective eaters. An example, the ostrich. It only eats certain seeds and certain flowers at certain times of the year. In this way, it does not directly compete with other animals that share the same space. Another example of the non-competitiveness is a giraffe. It feeds 16 feet up in the air. Who else would want to eat that high? They'd probably get indigestion. The range of animals in Africa is phenomenal, from the lofty giraffe down to one of the most beautiful of the antelope family, the impala, to a whimsical-looking creature that runs across the plains with its tail held high, the warthog. When we think of Africa, we usually think of cats. Kenya still has large numbers of cats in its national parks, lions and cheetah. These parks are not zoos. The animals must hunt in order to survive. Not all of the hunters, however, hunt on the ground. Some hunt from the air, such as this pair of tawny eagles that have flushed out a small duiker. That little antelope weighs more than the combined weights of the two birds. Yet after the kill, the vultures will come. There are 6 different species of vultures to be found in Africa. All 6 can sometimes be found at the same kill in Kenya, fighting and squabbling with members of their own species for a part of the meal. Vultures at a kill have always reminded me of a Sunday football game. People ask me if it isn't dangerous to camp in Africa with so many large animals around, such as the elephant. Not really. Generally, the animals are more curious than anything else. As long as you respect their right of way. I worry a great deal more about the little creatures of Africa than the big ones. The siafu and army ants could always find my camp. Some of the little ones were no problem at all. That dung beetle's still looking for a home. My favorite park is Tsavo National Park. 8,000 square miles near Mount Kilimanjaro, a vast dryland region, a land of volcanoes and lava fields, some of which are only 100 years old. We were flying into Tsavo to explore an unusual river, a river that flows underground for most of its distance, coming to the surface at only one spot, Mzima Springs. The water flows some 40 miles underground from the Chulu Range to where it bubbles to the surface at almost 2 million gallons an hour, crystal clear, forming an oasis in the desert. The water flows through a series of ponds and pools for about 1.5 miles until it disappears into the lava fields forever. One of our goals in coming to Mzima Springs was to search for the origin of the springs. One theory, a wild one at that, holds that the water may flow through underground lava tubes. We entered a number of these lava tubes. They're formed when the hot molten lava hardens on the outside and the soft inner core continues to flow out, leaving a hollow tube. And one we found an underground forest of tree roots. Deeper in the cave, we crawled on our hands and knees for long distances, over ground that was soft, spongy, moist and damp, created by thousands upon thousands of bats. Deeper in the cave, our lights got very dim. In fact, eventually they went out. Fortunately, we found a crack in the lava field. This was the way that the bats got out, and with the help of a small incentive, we managed to get out as well. After we escaped from the lava tube, we returned to Mzima Springs to observe some of the unusual wildlife of the area, including a white tree-climbing baboon. named Jim Hannon. He has a doctorate in marine biology and doesn't know what to do with it. So he spends all his time observing the hippos of Mzima Springs. One of the more common residents of the springs. They're found here along with the elephants. Elephants come in large numbers each day to bathe and to drink. Keeping cool is a big problem for large land animals in Africa. The elephant solves the problem by using its ears as giant radiators. They're 1/3 the body surface of the elephant. Hot blood comes into them, and cool blood, 10 degrees cooler, is returned to the body of the elephant. The hippo solves the problem of staying cool by spending all day in the water, only coming out at night to feed on about 150 pounds of food a night. In some respects, elephants are just a little bit like small kids. After a nice bath, they can't wait to get back and get dirty again. Although it has a very practical purpose, for although the elephant has no natural enemies except for man, he's constantly plagued by insects and parasites. Covering himself with water and dirt is a sort of insect barrier, and accounts for the many different colors of the elephants that you'll see in Africa. My companions, Phil and Jim, decided that they wanted to go swimming with the hippos of Mzima, for this is one of the few places in the world where you can observe the hippo clearly underwater. They found a pool with one hippo in it, and they swam out towards that hippo. Their theory was, since the hippos of Mzima had never been hunted, they wouldn't be dangerous. I volunteered to take pictures. What actually happened was, as Phil and Jim swam out towards the hippo took a dive. For hippos can stay down for about 3-4 minutes at a time. Phil and Jim swam around on the surface for a while, and then they decided to dive down and look for the hippo. Down they went, up came the hippo. The hippo went down, Phil and Jim came up. This happened a bunch of times until that hippo became 3. When Phil and Jim realized that they were surrounded by hippos, they very wisely retreated. In fact, we all retreated to the coast of Kenya, where you can dive in the warm waters of the Indian Ocean without any fear of hippos. The people that live along the coast of Kenya live in close harmony with the sea. Much of their food comes from it. They're excellent fishermen, and they're also outstanding sailors. For generations and centuries, they've used their dhows, driven by lantine sails that were known to the Phoenicians, to cross the Indian Ocean during the monsoon periods. And in one place along the coast of Kenya, they live their traditional lifestyle. That's Lamu, an island city, my favorite vacation spot, accessible only by the sea. A very tranquil and peaceful place. Here they continue to build their ocean-going dhows. All the materials are available locally. From the forests surrounding them, they take the timber. From the sisal plantations, they get the fiber for their ropes. And from the cotton, the caulking that they use to caulk the boats. These people are craftsmen. They take pride in their work. And they live in a small community of about 8,000 people in which everyone knows everyone else. It would be hard not to, for the main street is only an arm span wide and filled with the cries of children. And the call to prayer from the minarets, for this is a Muslim community. Along the coast of Kenya, the Arab influence has existed the longest, and the largest concentrations of Muslims is found in this area. In the traditional society along the coast of Kenya amongst the Swahili people, the women outside of the home wear black buibuis and cover their faces with veils. Inside the home, they take off the buibui and reveal the colorful conga they wear underneath. An important part of the coastal diet is the coconut. It's used in many different ways. Generally, the coconut meat will be scraped out of the shell of the coconut. Traditionally, dairy cattle did not survive well on the coast of Kenya. So they take the coconut meat, place it in straw containers, pour hot water over it. Then they'd squeeze it, knead it, until they produced milk, coconut milk, for use in their recipes that combined the flavor and spices of the Indian Ocean area and the Arabian Peninsula. Our vision of African history usually holds that Africa had little history before the arrival of the European. That's not really true. It's actually had a long and interesting history, a complicated one. For instance, Lamu. Linda Donnelly, a young American who's taking a degree in ethnoarchaeology from Cambridge, has dug down some 500 years into the past of Lamu. And what she's found is 500 years ago, the people of Lamu lived essentially the same lifestyle that they do today, except that 500 years ago, Lamu was already a very old city, that it had very specialized forms of written poetry for centuries, a city that traded as far away as the Mediterranean, India, and even China. And it was only one of many cities along the coast of Kenya, cities that are silent today, for only 2 of those cities remain. The rest are in ruins, only the chatter of the monkeys overlooking the mosques, palaces, and boulevards breaking the stillness. Of the 2 cities that remain, we visited one, Lamu, a city that looks to the past. The other is Mombasa, a city that looks to the future. For Mombasa is Kenya's 2nd largest city. Over the minarets of Old Town, office buildings now spire. The streets are filled with cars and buses and trucks. People pouring in by the thousands each year. And instead of dhows unloading in the harbor, today it's container ships and ocean-going liners. Because of the importance of this harbor, there's always been a naval force here. Before the British, the Portuguese had an interest. In the 1700s, they built Fort Jesus. Still stands today at the entrance to the old harbor. In 1697, a Portuguese ship sailed into the harbor to relieve the besieged garrison in Fort Jesus. It was sunk right underneath the walls of Fort Jesus by a round of fire from the Omani Arabs on the opposite shoreline. Today, Fort Jesus is once again under siege, but this time by school children. For now, it's part of the National Museum System of Kenya. In 1970, I worked for the museum excavating that 17th century galleon. Many of the artifacts that we brought up are today on display in Fort Jesus. The sinking of a ship is very important to archaeologists because it represents a moment in history that was frozen forever. Using it, they can date activities on the land before and after the sinking of the ship. One of my goals in returning to Kenya was to observe the progress of the excavation. With Conway Plow, one of the original discoverers of the ship, we took a drift dive. Off the tip of Mombasa Island, we followed the tides into the old harbor over the coral reefs of the Indian Ocean. Kenya has been at the forefront of marine conservation. It has 3 underwater parks to preserve species such as the hawksbill turtle and over 1,000 species of coral fish, from the Promacanthus and false Moorish idol to the squirrelfish hiding in the coral formations to one of the most beautiful of the Indo-Pacific region fish, beautiful but poisonous, the lion or turkey fish. Spines on its back are filled with venom. A diver has to be somewhat careful, for some of the species are very adept at camouflaging themselves. Find the dogfish. It also has venomous spines on its back, while other species merely hide in the sand. A leopard ray. There are many treasures to be found along the coast of Kenya, and Phil Snyder is very adept at finding some of these treasures. The real treasure we'd come to find, however, was the Santo Antonio di Tana. In 50 feet of water, it was very dim and very murky. We passed over some of the grids that were used for photographing the ship. A sunken ship is not like a real ship. It's more like a house of cards that's fallen down upon itself. All that remained were some of the giant timbers of the keel protruding from the mud, slowly being eaten away by the torpedo worm and other marine growth. Diving on the Santo Antonio di Tana was not only an opportunity to touch the past, but also to explore a wilderness, an underwater wilderness. There's another wilderness area I'd like to take you to right now. It's a much drier one, out onto the Great Plains of Africa, where in the very early morning, a lioness was watching an unusual activity. A giant balloon being filled with hot air to take us on a trip across the plains of Africa. We took off in the very early morning, for at that time the winds were gentle and calm. Later on, the hot African sun would create winds that make ballooning very dangerous. When we first took off, we could hear very little because of the roar of the gas jets in our ears, filling the balloon with hot air for our journey. Then Dudley turned off the gas jets and we floated in an eerie world of stillness. For a balloon travels at the same speed as the wind. There's no wind in your face. We were headed out towards one of the largest ecological units in Africa, the Serengeti Plains. Most of the Serengeti is located in Tanzania, but the northern part of it comes up into Kenya, an area that's called the Masai Mara. During the months of July, August, and September in most years, while the rest of the Serengeti is parched and lifeless, the northern part in Kenya is covered with thick grass and an abundance of water. It's at this time that many of the animals migrate to this area. One of the champion migrators is the wildebeest, also called the gnu, an ungainly-looking creature said to have been put together with all the bits and pieces left over from the other animals. Here the males establish territories which they defend against the advances of other males. In ritual battles in which there's no actual harm done to the fighting animals. After breeding, the animals will leave the area and travel southward. Scientists say there's several million animals to be found out on these plains at this time of the year. On the ground, you might see 50 or 60,000 in a day. But from a balloon, you could hope to see many more. A safe and stable platform, we could look down upon long lines of animals crossing the plains beneath us, much like ants crossing the kitchen floor. Our pilot, Dudley, was very skillful. He could not only take us up high, but he could also bring us right down to ground level. We'd skim across the grass like a boat cutting through the water. In front of us, the long lines of animals would break into a run that enables them to cover 50 or more miles each day in response to some inner urge that tells them they must migrate in order to survive. Theirs was an endless journey. Ours was coming to an end. Dudley pulled a panel on the top of the balloon, letting out some of the hot air. Our chase vehicles had caught up with us. A balloon landing is a very exciting part of a balloon trip. But Dudley promised us a safe and a comfortable landing, and it was for everybody in the balloon except for one person who insisted on taking a photograph and managed to fall out. Fortunately, Dudley had a suitable antidote for a bruised ego and a bruised rear. He brought out a champagne breakfast to enjoy on the plains of Africa. There's still adventure to be found in Africa, so go to Africa and expect to see the animals of Africa. Although certain species are being hurt by poaching, most are surviving, especially inside the parks. But when you do go to Africa, don't forget the people of Africa. For often, as we travel around the world, we tend to focus on the differences amongst people. And we don't take the time to look at all the similarities. And all you really have to do is to watch children laughing, playing, singing, crying, inventing their own games, to realize that it just isn't all that big of a world that we share. Thank you all very much for traveling to Africa, and have a safe journey home this afternoon.